All right. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everybody. As Rachel said, this is the inaugural kickoff webinar for our new Working Land series. Coming up, we've got our next one's going to be all in Spanish on what are pollinators and how you can conserve them. And then we're going to get into many of the details that I'm going to sort of queue up today. Today's webinar is really to kind of kick it all off and give context, but then we'll dig in quite a bit more detail on rangelands and habitat on working lands, soil invertebrates, a little bit more about getting to know those good bugs that are out there, how do you find them, and then how to support pollinators over time, how do we manage wildflower diversity. So this is all coming up from the Xerces Society in our webinar series. We also, though, partner really closely, and I'll talk more about this as we go on, with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And the NRCS hosts their own webinar series through conservationwebinars.net. And we've got a couple of those coming up in collaboration with NRCS, one on beneficial insects in our soil and another on wetlands and pollinators. So how do we think about incorporating pollinator habitat and conservation into a variety of different wetland conservation projects from coast to coast? And I have to say, we'll talk at the end about getting connected with the recorded webinars that have come straight from Xerces, but even you can also go to conservationwebinars.net, do a search for Xerces and find everything, webinars on everything from dragonflies and freshwater mussels to pollinators to other beneficial insects, habitat management, conservation, restoration. There's a lot there, and plus just a lot of fun stuff to get lost in. So all of these are coming up, and just diving right in. I wanted to, just for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with Xerces, give a quick little background on the Xerces Society. We've been around for coming up on 50 years. This year is our 50th anniversary. And over those 50 years, our core mission has been focused on protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And when I started 20 years ago, there were 5 of us, only one person worked full time. And today we are more than 50 strong at our 50th year, with offices all across the country. And we are named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly to go extinct in the US because of habitat loss. Because of habitat loss. So the focus of this webinar is really going to, I guess, jump off from and kind of focus on the work that my team, my pollinator and ag biodiversity conservation team, focuses on. This is a team of about 24 staff across the country. 13 of those staff are in partner positions, collaborating super closely with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, either working out of local field offices, maybe state offices, and in my case, in the case of a couple others, working out of regional offices, providing technical support, frankly, all across the country. And then paired with these folks are a whole group of people who are providing supervisory support, technical support, really bringing together a diversity of expertise from pesticide risk reduction to restoration to farming, to beekeeping to native plant conservation. Oh my goodness, just a whole slew of different skills on our staff that we bring together to be able to support. And I'll come to this over and over again, support those of you working on farms and ranches, even on forests across the country. So we'll come back to this again at the end. Our work at Xerces focuses on pollinators and conservation biological control and ag diversity and wildlife, endangered species, aquatic invertebrates, pesticide protection, urban conservation, a whole certification for farmers, recognizing what they're doing on the ground that supports pollinators, a growing collaboration of cities and campuses across the country that are part of our Bee City, Bee Campus effort, not to mention a slew of community science projects from monarchs to bumblebees all across the country. Just an amazing diversity of projects all around working with the public to really get good habitat on the ground. And we can't do that without the support and collaboration of literally thousands of partners. We've got 12,000 members in 15 countries who provide ongoing support, financial support for our work, hundreds of farmers, hundreds of land managers that we've worked with on habitat and reduced risk pest management projects, scores of private foundations, hundreds of scientists at universities around the world, dozens of federal, state, and local agencies like the NRCS. Over 50 companies provide support for our work, and just thousands of people, I'm sure many of you who are active in your neighborhoods, your farms, your public spaces, everything across the country, helping to get habitat on the ground. So I gotta say, it's an honor, frankly, that you all are joining us. It's an honor to work with my team and all these amazing partners who are just part of this effort to get, frankly, really high quality wildlife habitat, biodiversity on the ground. So if you want, I'd encourage you to consider supporting Xerces as a member, something to think about. You can go to our website. You could even become a member and get a sign. We've got a new sign right now on pollinator habitat that just came in. These are things you could do. If you're interested, please feel free to check it out and think about that. And with that, let's dig in. So as Rachel and I've both said, this webinar is really meant to kind of cue up why are we even having, frankly, kind of a whole webinar series on working lands. And why do we think it's important to work on invertebrate and insect conservation on these landscapes? And so today what I want to walk through are, frankly, both the benefits of, say, invertebrate, pollinator, beneficial insect conservation for farms and ranches, but also just talk about what these animals mean for healthy soils, what these animals mean for fish and wildlife, for range and pasture quality, and then to dig into the fact that, frankly, we're looking at invertebrates are kind of facing hard times right now. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on and what we know about declines in these animals, and then end on a higher note of, hey, what is it that we are doing and can be doing more of, and how can we really help farmers and ranchers do this work? I mean, ideally, this is a private resource. This is something that supports farm production, that supports ranching, but it's also part of the natural heritage, of the US or of wherever you live. And ideally, the public at large, would be part of encouraging, supporting, helping to make sure that those of you who are farmers and ranchers are able to really, do this and be rewarded, frankly, for taking action that's boosting the populations of beneficial insects across the country. So we're working hard to come up with ways to ideally make it pay. Folks, I'd rather farmers and ranchers didn't have to work at the bank or the co-op or, somewhere else that you can make a living consistently on the farm. And I don't know, it's one of those things I think about a lot. We ask a lot of our working lands and those who manage our working lands. And so part of what Xerces really tries to do is come to the table to provide tools to help make that as easy as possible, whether that's technical support, tying into financial support, coming up with other ways to reward that great work on the ground. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And frankly, I'll probably send out thanks to the farm and ranch community several times through this talk. So with that, it would be really helpful for me to have a little better sense of kind of who you all are, who's joining in this webinar. We got close to 200 people logged in. Rachel's going to put up a poll here and get a sense of kind of how you all, would identify yourselves. And you can choose more than one. But I'd love to know kind of how many folks are working in agriculture and kind of what your role is and all of that. Oh, look at this. All right. Nice. I really like these polls. These are kind of amazing. Oh, look at this. All right, a real range of folks here. This is excellent. A lot of partners working on conservation planning with NRCS and the conservation districts. A lot of folks coming in from nonprofit sector. Good number of farmers and ranchers. Master gardeners coming in. All right, just folks who are interested. All right, that's great. This is excellent. All right. Sweet. All right, a lot of gardeners out there. All right, well, we'll make the case. This all applies to gardens too, so that'll be great. Excellent. This is good to see. So we've got a really wide diversity of folks, and I'll try to keep this in mind as we, as we roll through. All right. Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to close that down. Cool. All right, well, let's dive in. So as you saw from the outline, we're going to go through kind of all the major ways that insects and other invertebrates provide benefits to working landscapes. And the one that's gotten probably the most attention, and really where Xerces has put in the most work over the last 20 years, even before that, over the last 50 years, has been on pollinator conservation, pollinator habitat conservation. So, a lot of you know, if you've been to any of our talks before on pollinators, know that more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly an insect, to move pollen around, and that this provides tremendous value for our food systems. 35% of crop production worldwide, $18 to $27 billion worth of crops. I'm going to come back to this. 217 billion worldwide. Most of our vitamins and minerals come from insect pollinated plants. We get a lot of calories from corn and wheat and rice, but we get most of our vitamins and minerals from our fruits and vegetables. And that, if you look at all those fruits and vegetables, if you look at oils from canola and sunflower, if you look at milk products and meat products that come from animals fed on alfalfa, for which you needed a pollinator to grow the seed to then grow that alfalfa hay, scientists estimate that roughly 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food we consume, comes from a pollinator. And actually just last night, I was sent a study. There's a new study that just came out providing evidence that pollinators are actually responsible for closer to $34 billion of crop production in the US, with this really nice map as part of this study showing the value of crops on a by county basis across the country that are pollinator dependent. So I was pretty excited to see this. This is it's a nice update to get this. So thought I'd put that out there too. So when we think about pollinators, for years, and rightly so when it comes to farm and crop pollination, honeybees come out as, really they are the major managed crop pollinator, but there are hundreds of native bee species that depend on high quality habitat and landscapes around farms and ranches that provide crop pollination services to berries and tree fruit, nuts, tomatoes, sunflower, squash, melons. Just hundreds of species have been recorded providing this benefit. And a study that I did years ago with a colleague at Cornell, John Losey, we estimated that from the native bee community, that was probably $3 billion worth of crop production each year that, arguably you could say was because of native pollinators in the landscape. I would say the new study that came out, this is going to be significantly higher, I'm sure, based on that new study. And as we look at native pollinators, one thing that's really nice to think about or important to think about is when we see those bees in the landscape, they're doing quite a bit more work. So if we see fewer of them, they're doing quite a bit more work than the honeybees that are out there. So sometimes we may see fewer native bees there, but often they're, at least according to this one study from about 5 or 6 years ago, setting twice as much fruit as honeybees. So they can be really valuable pollinators. And they do this because they're active earlier in the day, they're active in cooler and wetter weather. This is particularly important for spring pollinated crops. They can perform buzz pollination where they're shaking the flowers to release pollen. And this would be tomatoes or cranberries or blueberries all really benefit from that vibration to really get that pollen out of the flowers. Bees also collect pollen and nectar when foraging, native bees in particular. Honeybees can sometimes specialize and they'll just collect nectar and they might even miss the pollen structures of the plant. Like going back here, a lot of times on apple bloom, honeybees will go underneath the anthers, the pollen structures on the flower and miss them all together, whereas a lot of our native bees are just all in that thing. There's no rental fees, although we do have to manage the landscape. We have to think about protecting the landscape and, that comes at a cost in time and effort. So, sure that you don't have to rent native bees, but you got to work to make sure that they're out there. So there's a cost. So they can be pretty important. And a lot of studies over the years have shown their value. For example, in sunflowers and almonds in California, having native bees in that landscape increases the efficiency of honeybees. Those honeybees just move around between say male and female plants in the case of sunflower, or between different varieties of almonds or tree fruit in the case of almonds or other tree fruit. And that more random movement just moves more pollen to where it needs to be for effective seed set or fruit set. So just making them, making honeybees more efficient, not to mention the work that those native bees are doing as well. You know, we've got habitat in the landscape in a much more diverse landscape like New Jersey. You know, 90% of farms studied in New Jersey, where you've got smaller farms tucked in with neighborhoods and parks and natural areas and all sorts of habitat variety. You know, 90% of those farms studied actually getting all their pollination from wild bees. So it's something that, you know, we encourage farmers and those who work with farmers to be out there during, you know, crop bloom, at least for insect pollinated crops, to be looking to see kind of what's in there doing that work for you on the ground. We also know that when you create habitat around insect pollinated crops, you will see, or create or protect, you'll see either more bees or more production. So if we look, for example, here at pollinator reservoirs, so habitats created around lowbush blueberry in Maine, that more bees are present around the reservoirs, significantly more, and that over time, going from 2013, for example, to 2015, that you see a measurable increase in actual fruit set, you know, a 10% increase in fruit set documented in Maine, in blueberries in Maine. If you go to high bush blueberries in Michigan, researchers there at Michigan State documented a 12% increase in blueberry yields adjacent to those wildflower plantings, and estimated that you could recoup the cost of establishing a high quality pollinator meadow within 3 or 4 years. So again, demonstrating the value, the crop pollination and the crop production value of habitat adjacent to a crop. You know, another study, just sticking with the blueberry theme, this one in British Columbia finds that the more natural areas you've got around a blueberry field, the greater the abundance of bumblebees, and also the greater the fruit set there as well. You know, just continuing in this sort of vein, oops, there we go. You know, we work a lot creating hedgerows, frankly, increasingly in the East. Mostly these have been West Coast phenomenon, but more and more in the East, we're seeing the planting of hedgerows, diverse, really plant diverse, plant rich, you know, hedgerows. And with research conducted in California, we see that, you know, the richness and the diversity of bees and syrphid flies that are important for pest management are all higher around hedgerow sites than they are around, you know, typically weedy field borders. And that if you go out into a crop field, you know, you consistently see more, you see more bees in those crop fields, even as much as 200 meters out, when you've got diverse native hedgerow habitat around the edges. So again, just demonstrating this value and the contribution from those habitats. So we've got pollination and pollinator habitat, and recognizing that, you know, for those of you who grow or work with growers of insect pollinated crops, you know, there's value in thinking about managing for bees in that landscape. But there's also pest control. A lot of the insects that are out there are really important for managing crop pests. So only about 2% of insect species that we find in these landscapes and agricultural or working landscapes are pests. That means that the bulk of the rest are either neutral or actually fighting or eating those pests. And, you know, I estimated, again, with John, that $4.5 to $12 billion, and this is back in 2006, that potentially $4.5 to $12 billion worth of crops are saved every year just by the natural pest suppression from these beneficial insects in the landscape. And these animals live similarly to pollinators. They may dwell in the soil within a crop or beneath the soil. They may be in the surrounding habitat. And so thinking about those habitats and thinking about protecting them, managing them, creating them could be important, you know, another important reason to work on invertebrate and insect conservation in working lands. So we know from several studies that there's a direct link between habitat and beneficial insect abundance and diversity. In fact, some studies show that if more than 20% of a farm has some sort of habitat diversity that's protected and managed, that you will see some level of pest control by beneficial insects throughout the entirety of the farm. And these might be lacewing or lacewing larvae, or lady beetles that are eating aphids, or parasitoid wasps that are attacking everything from aphids to stink bugs to you know, leaf rollers and cabbage loopers, just a whole variety of beneficial insects that we can support in the landscape. And many studies over the years have demonstrated the value of having different types of habitat in the landscape for actually providing that service. So one example here from Georgia showed that when you've got buckwheat cover crops near soybeans, that you'll get more, more wasp parasitism. So these tiny little wasps right here lay their eggs in stink bug eggs. The wasp eggs hatch and feed on those stink bug eggs, subsequently causing stink bug numbers to go way down. So this has been really valuable for pest management in, around soybean. Again, going back to the hedgerow example, not only are diverse hedgerows supporting pollinators, but they're also supporting beneficial insects that provide pest control. So using stink bugs as another example, a study looking at stink bug parasitism in tomato fields next to hedgerows, next to, basically weedy field borders, found that there is a tripling of the parasitism rate of those egg masses. So once again, having habitat supports, frankly, what are tiny little insects you would never notice unless you were looking for them, that get out there and do quite a bit of pest control. And we know too from a variety of studies that when we control certain pests, or when we put, different sort of pest control practices, we have the potential of killing beneficial insects that then lead to outbreaks of other pests. And this has been well documented in lots of places. One study that came up relatively recently, that's a nice segue in this talk, is just looking at the loss of predatory ground beetles, which are really important for pest control as well as weed control, I'll talk about in a minute, in crop fields. Losing those predatory ground beetles led to outbreaks in slugs, literally what they were calling in Pennsylvania Slugmageddon, where you just had thousands, hundreds of thousands of slugs devouring crops, all because of in this case, insecticide treated soybeans being grown and killing out the ground beetles in those landscapes. So this is a nice segue because I want to now focus on soil invertebrates and the value of soil invertebrates in working lands and why we should be thinking about them as well, which is something Xerces is increasingly working on with a whole set of guidelines and a webinar series coming out just around soil invertebrates in the months ahead. So a lot of people know about beneficial insects for pollination and pest control, and a lot of people are focused right now on soil health. And a lot of that focus on soil health is microbes and nematodes and all these sort of beneficial, almost sort of microorganisms that are in farmland. But there are so many invertebrates, so many insects and worms and other things that are critically important for basically building soil and indicative of healthy soil and healthy soil management. So insects in particular, as well as worms, are really the first stage of decomposition in the creation of soil organic matter. Ants, worms, other things are dragging a huge amount of organic material underground to be able to help in building soil. So they do a massive amount of what we call sort of soil churning, taking organic matter on the surface, bringing it underneath, trying to pull it down. They move beneficial fungi and other microbes around. So if a soil has been, if a lot of those fungi have been removed and we're trying to rebuild soil health, insects and other invertebrates are really helping to jumpstart that process and keep that process going. And there can be literally thousands of insects, spiders, and other arthropods in any square meter of prairie or forest. And so you can imagine, like, ideally in our ag lands, we're trying to bring some of that abundance and diversity and variety there as well. These animals can be active, as much as 10 feet deep. Some of them can be extremely long-lived. So if we remove them from the landscape, sometimes it can take time for them to come back. But when we see them, that's often a sign of, quality soil management. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Interesting, I like to focus a little bit too on ants. They can be some of our most abundant arthropods in most soils. They're huge soil engineers, probably right up there with just, plant roots and worms. And from one study in Massachusetts, they are potentially moving 30 tons of soil per acre per year. And you can imagine what that's doing in terms of turning over soil, bringing nutrients, bringing carbon down. They're just hugely important. If we look at seed feeding beetles that are living in that soil surface, ideally that we're managing for to try to protect, they can be voracious consumers of a whole variety of weed seed, like lamb's quarters, ragweed, pigweed, velvetleaf, foxtail, crabgrass, all sorts of these things, and can, at least according to one study, feed on and eat anywhere between 74 and over 200 seeds in 48 hours, depending on the species. So, are they going to solve your weed problems? No, of course not. But could they be playing a role in helping to manage weed seed, not to mention pests, in cropland? Absolutely. I mean, these animals are, they're doing work for us. They're really out there doing the job. Which leads me to wildlife. So we move away from what could be, what we would think of as sort of direct economic or production benefits of invertebrates, starting to get more into, things that get at are, frankly, what I personally value. Thinking about, for example, songbirds, game birds, other wildlife. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because in my work, getting out there in the field with farmers and ranchers, with folks who are managing forests around farms and ranches, so many of those people, so many of you are in this because, you think birding is fun, you think songbirds are fun. Seeing songbirds come in the springtime is a sign that things are right. Many of you hunt game birds. Really to have a whole variety, of healthy wildlife all across our country, invertebrates are an anchor for those food webs. So let's look a little bit at that. If we just look at bird and mammal diets, 25% of bird and mammal diets consist of pollinator-produced seeds and fruit. So again, going back to the pollinators, we've got to have them out there for just supporting that plant production, and so many animals will feed on those birds and those seeds and fruit. Pollinators and other insects that we're focused on here today, just by themselves, are food for wildlife. So when we create a landscape that is rich with abundant insects, we are feeding 89% of all bird species. And not to mention just creating habitats that are supportive of a whole wide variety of wildlife. So let's just look at songbirds for a second. 96% of songbirds, so 89% of birds overall during some life stage feed on insects, but 96% of songbirds rear their young on invertebrates alone. If we take like chickadees as one example, they'll gather 10,000 caterpillars to successfully raise a brood of chicks. And so, you've got to have good invertebrate, you got to have good bug habitat in the landscape. As my old friend Wendell Gilgert always says, bugs drive the system. So we got to have bugs to drive the wildlife system. For those of you working on game bird, either conservation or those who like to hunt, if we just look at several studies on game birds, maybe one in particular on sage grouse, showed that the survival of chicks and brood was significantly influenced by butterfly and moth caterpillar availability. Like, this was one of the key drivers for whether or not sage grouse could, successfully reproduce. Same is true for prairie chicken, for bobwhite quail. There's studies all across the country showing when we've got diverse plant communities that support diverse and abundant insect communities, that these chicks just do better. So if we're managing range or any landscape for sage grouse, quail, pheasant, or other game birds, that means we also need to be managing for insect abundance. It's just part of the deal. And people don't often think, in our work, they're not often thinking about fish and water quality, but aquatic invertebrates are vital for most fish species. Like, if you just look at juvenile salmon, midges are one of the most important food sources, little types of flies that are in the water, not to mention mayflies and stoneflies and caddis and all these different things, all these different animals that we would find in streams that our trout, our salmon, so many of our fish feed on. And if we follow this up the food chain and kind of tie a bunch together, now, not many of you are going to have brown bears on your farms and ranches or with the folks you work with, but just thinking about salmon that rely on invertebrates or berries that rely on pollination, these are at the top of these food webs. When we get to things like bears, insects are driving so much of this system and are so critical for supporting these wildlife food webs that I think a lot of people, particularly I'm sure many of you, really value. One area where we're working more and more as well, where invertebrates and management for invertebrates plays a really important role, are rangeland and pasture, and thinking about range and pasture health. If we manage these areas for healthy insect populations, that means we're managing for plant diversity and allowing for bloom. That means that for a lot of those livestock, there are wildflowers out there that are, that provide unique and unique nutrients that maybe cattle and goats and sheep aren't necessarily getting from just grass. If we're managing for bloom and diversity in the landscape, we're managing for drought resilience as we're facing climate change and these increased cycles of wet and dry. Being able to kind of weather, so to speak, these dry periods means managing for deeper roots, for healthier plants, which leads ultimately to healthier range for cattle. If we manage for diversity, we're managing away from grasshopper outbreaks. Diversity of plants in the landscape means a diversity of grasshoppers, and you don't have nearly the same level of outbreaks that we might see if you're just managing for grass. And then, and this is where it gets kind of fun for me, we're managing for healthy dung beetle communities. So I want to focus on dung beetles for a while because they kind of tie a couple of things together we've talked about. So as I mentioned, when we're talking about soil, invertebrates decompose over 90% of plant, human, and animal waste. But these animals, in so doing, at least on the animal waste, are cleaning up rangeland and pastures, all across the country. And we've estimated that might be worth a total of $380 million of additional forage available for cattle, sheep, goats, et cetera, just by, when a dung patty hits the ground, being able to clean that up as efficiently and quickly as possible. So in a range setting, removing dung and breaking it down as fast as possible is important for just forage abundance. But it's also, by breaking those dung patties apart, by tearing them down, by moving them underground, you can reduce calf parasites by 70%. You can eliminate methane by up to 12%. And in a farm landscape, having dung beetles, ideally a diversity of dung beetles, takes all those little animal droppings, whatever might be out there in broccoli and blueberries, in leafy greens, and pulls them down and brings any feces, anything that might be out there, pulls it out of the landscape, and has been demonstrated through a number of studies to be really important for getting E. coli and other pathogens out of farmland. And it's just interesting that greater the diversity of dung beetles on farms, the safer they are from a food safety perspective. So I don't know, and plus they're cool. They're very cool little animals. Let's see, I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm just going to look at the questions, see if we can tackle a couple of these before we head into this next section. Yes, so Chris, I see your note there. I will, at the end here, put a link, see if I can put a link to that study in the chat box for everybody. So, or maybe, I'll see if I can do that. Rachel went out from Matthew to the whole team yesterday. So if you got that, you might be able to grab it. Athena, book on beneficial insects has a short section on beetle banks. I'd love to see a whole chapter. Yes, let's talk about that. That would be great. We'll see what we can do about getting more out there. There's a growing interest in beetle banks on farms as a control method for a variety of pests, including slugs. So let's see what we can do there. Jamie, can we talk about pour over? Yes. Interestingly, so ivermectins are medicine, drugs given to livestock, usually for deworming and parasites, and they frequently end up in dung. They end up in fact, not just of cows, but when they're given to dogs and other things too, and they can be in the dung at a high enough level that that they can actually kill the dung beetle community and lead to dung patties not breaking down as quickly. And in fact, the NRCS has a new enhancement under the Conservation Stewardship Program in some states to help producers kind of address concerns or perceived or risks of not using ivermectins to try to build up dung beetle populations, and also thinking about managing cattle in such a way that when combined with strong dung beetle populations, you're able to just keep that range healthy or break those dung beetles down more quickly. So I do know that's available. I think a lot of, in my talk with range managers and range cons, particularly in North Dakota and South Dakota, so much of the remedy for not using ivermectins, for not using these medicines, is in thinking about how you're managing your cattle. So I could follow up with those folks who are much more specialized on range management and get back to you on that, Jamie. So I'll have an email that comes up at the end. Shoot me an email and I'll connect you with some ideas on alternatives, particularly alternative management systems to help with that. Let's see. I'm going to see some of these. I may wait till the end. What are most prominent barriers? Okay, I'll come back. Melissa, I'll hit that a little bit later. Yes. Actually, so some of these are looking good. Let's do this. Oh, excellent. All right. I'm going to sort of take a break here for a moment on these questions. Some of these are great ones that I'll address a little bit more in the slides that come up. So let's get back into this presentation and keep the questions coming. This is excellent. All right, so what I meant to queue up to so far is that there are all these, I mean, frankly, you could think of them as economic reasons. There are these reasons that for conserving invertebrates because of the services they provide us. Frankly, I got into this partially because of that. I was a beekeeper who started seeing the whole diversity of bees that were out there and then other insects on flowers. And I just got hooked on the stories of these tiny little animals, this wildlife that's, I had never noticed before. And this is my early 20s. And for me, invertebrate conservation is a value for all these, frankly, economic reasons, but also just because of the inherent value of the diversity of this wildlife. Each of these animals has a story to tell, which for me was kind of how I got hooked on insects and in entomology in the first place. So I don't want to lose sight of that. These animals have inherent value. And right now, as you all I'm sure have heard, and probably part of the reason you're on this is that insects and other invertebrates are really having tough times. And I want to focus on that for a few minutes. There are studies, there are headlines from all across the world about flying insects vanishing, where have the insects gone, insect Armageddon, patterns of widespread decline. I mean, all these stories that have come out, year after year, again and again about declining insects. And one thing we've talked a lot about at Xerces is what we're calling the windshield effect. When I was a kid in the 1970s, driving across Missouri, driving across Illinois, Indiana, and every time we stopped for gas, in the summertime, we had to get the windshield, washer out of the gas station and clean off all the bugs, the midges, the flies, the mosquitoes, the mayflies, stoneflies, whatever was out there crashing into our car. And you just don't see that nearly as much. And they've talked about, maybe it has to do with aerodynamics and all that. Yeah, that doesn't change that much. We just don't see the impact. And we just don't see the abundance of invertebrates that we once did across the landscape. And don't get me wrong, there's still outbreaks here and there of mayflies, for example, or midges coming out. But you just don't see the abundance and the dirty windshields we used to. And we know from a whole variety of studies all across the world that insect diversity and abundance and biomass are decreasing. So Germany recently had a study that came out that showed that more than 70% of flying insects biomass is down. If we look at butterflies, in the UK, more than 50% of butterfly species have declined in abundance over 10 years. In Ohio, there's been a 33% reduction in butterfly abundance over 21 years. There are widespread declines in common species, like the monarch butterfly that's gotten a ton of news to the point that the Western population is on the brink of extinction. We've got a data set of 45 years of monitoring across Northern California that finds that all butterfly groups are declining at all of the sites that are studied. So across the board, we're seeing this downward trend in butterflies. Bumblebees, 28% of bumblebees are considered threatened or at risk of, or some sort of extinction risk category. If we look at tiger beetles, approximately a third of tiger beetles are sufficiently rare to be considered threatened or endangered. If we look at mayflies, and a study in the upper Midwest found that the biomass, just the total abundance of mayflies has declined by over 50%. This just goes on and on. If we look at our aquatic species, 43% of stoneflies are at some sort of extinction risk. 65% of freshwater mussels, 64% of aquatic snails, 50-ish% of crayfish, all are in decline all across the US. And if we just take this in sum, looking across the world, although only 1% of invertebrate species have been assessed for what sort of conservation threats they're facing by the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, 40% of that 1% that has been looked at are considered to have some sort of threatened status. And as we look at these studies over time from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, Lepidoptera are generally, the abundance of butterflies and moths are in decline. And if you look at all the other invertebrates, the downward trends are everywhere. Whew, okay, that's the depressing part of this talk. But I think there's, well, I'll call it a silver lining, I'll call it an opportunity. This is where working lands comes into play. And I feel like this is where farmers and ranchers and small forest owners, this is where you all and the folks you all work with who are in those positions, can be and are heroes. So if we look across the world, 40% of the land on our planet is used for some sort of agriculture, particularly pasture and cropland in this case. And it's no surprise, like everybody knows, it's not a surprise, and it's, that those working lands are certainly part of the cause of invertebrate declines. Pesticide use and exposure, the loss of habitat, the fragmentation of habitat, all of that plays into why we're losing invertebrates and also why we're losing other wildlife all across the country. But that also means that those working lands, those pasture, that range, those crops, can also be part and are increasingly a part of turning this around, of bringing habitat back in a way that's both supportive of production, supportive of those farm communities ideally, and also supportive of all this wildlife and diversity that we've got all across the world. So I want to focus on this, and I'm going to come back to this again in a month with one of the next webinars in this series, where we really dig a lot deeper on conservation options in the landscape. And this is a pretty idealized farm. I mean, if you're in the Central Valley of California, the heart of the Midwest, there may be many fewer sort of landscape opportunities there, but this is just useful for showing that on a farm, you may have woodlots or, kind of open savanna or wetlands and ponds or hedgerows and windbreaks, road edges and farmsteads and, I guess where you've got your barns and all of your equipment. You've got a whole variety of different types of habitat in a farm landscape, a whole variety of different opportunities. And so I want to just hit on some of those opportunities and how we've worked over the years to really think about how do we take advantage of these places on the farm, places on the ranch where you can create habitat and sort of bring pollinator, beneficial insect, wildlife habitat elements into the land. And one of the things, struggle with is the wrong word, but one of the things I'm really aware of, and I mentioned this early on, is just how much farmers and ranchers are already doing and how hard it is to make a living, on a working landscape these days without it being huge, without having, a certain number of cattle in production, for example. And recognizing that when doing work to conserve invertebrates, ideally we are layering that on top of a whole suite, a whole variety of other natural resource conservation goals. For example, when working on water quality protection, whether that's sediment capture, nutrient capture, pesticide capture, water cooling, thinking about the plant communities we put in the ground when doing that work can go a long way towards protecting water quality and providing habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects and wildlife. If we're worried about weed seed capture, we can create landscapes, hedgerows, for example, that are trying to grab weed seed out of the air, weed seed that's flowing across the ground, and drop that outside of our ag fields, and have it, have some sort of pollinator habitat or beneficial insect habitat provide that service as well. Weed suppression, replacing weedy areas on a farm with native plants consistently reduces pest pressure in the landscape and increases other beneficial insects. Habitat can be a buffer against adjacent pesticide use, protecting the invertebrates on your farm or on your land, potentially from exposure to pesticides around it. Screening and noise reduction, wildlife habitat and corridors, beautification and neighbor relations. As urban and suburban areas expand, there are more and more conflicts between farmers who've been there for decades and these new folks coming in the landscape. And so, building a beautiful hedgerow that provides abundant wildlife habitat, abundant insect habitat, and beautifies the landscape can also be that nice barrier, living barrier between, neighbors who maybe don't want to see, tractors running, going through their backyard. And I don't know, the cranberry growers, for example, in Southeast Massachusetts have thought about this a lot and encountered this a lot, and where having, barriers or borders of habitat can go a long way towards, keeping things, reducing stress with neighbors. Increasingly, under this new administration in the White House, but also just with Xerces' work in general, we're thinking more and more about climate change resilience. How do we sequester carbon? How do we account for and help to, help mitigate the risks of climate change on just wildlife and habitat across the country? And thinking about incorporating invertebrates into those nature-based solutions to climate change, I think is something we're going to be working on more and more in the years ahead. And as we think about this, there are a lot of different strategies we can and need to be, considering when trying to manage for invertebrates in working lands. So obviously pesticides are, they're a pretty important driver of insect decline in invertebrates. And so it's important to work to minimize those impacts and think about how we can reduce watershed contamination, how we can reduce off-site spray drift, how we can just be more targeted, and ideally be implementing integrated pest and pollinator management strategies that just reduce the impact of pest management in the landscape. I don't think there's any surprise there, but this has to be, an important strategy as we try to think about, supporting beneficial insects in the landscape. But then there's habitat, and there are so many interesting and creative ways to bring habitat that supports all of these beneficial insects into the working landscape. So you can just have wildflower plantings, adjacent to crops, under crops. We've got pivot corners that are increasingly being used where they're just weed patches that if we can get the weeds out, we can bring in other beneficial insect habitat or other beneficial habitat that reduces that pest pressure. We've got field borders of native plants, field borders of clover or buckwheat or phacelia, filter strips that are created to grab sediment or to stabilize stream banks that are at the same time providing an abundance of forage for pollinators. Hedgerows come up again and again in California. Here's another hedgerow in Idaho, in Oregon. I mean, these habitats are springing up and we're helping to get these habitats on the ground all across the country. Thinking about riparian forest buffers or hedgerows here through the heart of, California almond country, taking sloughs and waterways and adding hedgerows all along them for miles. These are increasingly being done, implemented on landscapes across the country. Thinking about riparian cover, that's, shading streams, cooling water, stabilizing banks, dropping organic matter into streams that become food for a whole variety of invertebrates that then become food for fish. There's a lot of this, just getting pollinator habitat into these riparian areas. So you can have your Euphemia occidentalis here and your asters feeding a ton of critters, along streams, and at the same time, again, stabilizing those banks. Wetlands, all wetlands can be managed, restored, enhanced with native plants that are adapted to those wetland environments, whether it's in the water or on the uplands or along the emergent marsh, that can provide abundant habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects. Cover cropping, incorporating cover crops into our agricultural systems to break pest cycles, to provide these flushes of bloom, even underneath orchards. As long as you don't have a vole problem here, it's clover makes me a little nervous under orchards, but that's another story we'll dig into later. Thinking about crop rotation, conservation crop rotation, and having mustard, for example, that's maybe important for putting down diseases in the soil, but also could provide abundance of bloom. Again, thinking about breaking pest cycles or providing an abundance of flowers and nectar for honeybees and native bees and a whole variety of important insects in the landscape. Insectary strips, maybe these can be used just to bring insects into diversified farms, or maybe these are used for cut flowers, providing double benefit. In fact, we just had Alina Harris, one of our staff in New Hampshire, just did a webinar a few days ago on cut flowers and insectary strips in the Northeast, where she's working in New Hampshire. Alley cropping, we're working more and more with agroforesters and thinking about how to bring in, particularly in the context of diversity and resilience and climate change and carbon sequestration, bringing practices like alley cropping into greater prominence. Thinking about wood management and less expensive options from planting wildflower meadows. Maybe we're just pushing back a wood edge to get more ventilation onto a field, or to just have the native plant community come back, in woodlands that maybe haven't been thinned, or where they've just been encroaching and growing all across the country, especially here in the Northeast or in the Northeast. Silvopasture as a practice, grazing management, as I mentioned before, to allow for bloom, whether you're on native range in the Southern Great Plains or the Northern Great Plains, managing cattle and other livestock in a way to allow for diversity and abundance. These are all strategies that we're working on across the country, thinking about pasture management and incorporating more forage legumes, and we'll talk more about that later. Reduced tillage is a huge practice that the NRCS has focused on for years, and increasingly thinking about soil health. Those same practices are fundamental and vital for protecting and supporting, ground insects in the ground, soil on the surface dwelling insects, that are down in this layer of organic matter coming out to feed on weed seeds, coming out to feed on pests, helping to build soil. Thinking about reduced tillage is just really important. And I recognize, from the start that this is work. Like, we're asking farmers and ranchers to do more when already, God knows, they've got enough going on. And so this is where, it's been important to me personally in building this team of folks all across the country that were sensitive to those challenges, but also there to provide as much support as we can. So getting out in the field, our folks are out in the field, working with the NRCS, working with conservation districts, working directly with farmers and ranchers to think about what are these options, and to help with that thought process, to help with the homework, to think about what are those creative options for protecting or improving habitat for invertebrates all across the country. Those same folks, this great team of people that I work with, produce fact sheets and brochures and guidelines and reports and conservation plans. Our job is to really take the science that's out there and distill it down in a way that hopefully makes it easier for farmers, for ranchers, for the NRCS, for conservation districts, to take all this knowledge and all these goals and to come up with to help people get it implemented on the ground. We also work really closely with those Farm Bill programs and with the NRCS to help in the implementation of things like the Conservation Reserve Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, to help in the conservation planning to get, so that farmers and ranchers can get, at the very least, technical assistance. And if they're willing and interested in filing the paperwork and going through the process, even potentially financial assistance to implement these projects on the ground, whether it's habitat or integrated pest and pollinator management to reduce, come up with creative ways to both address pest problems and have the least impact. Our staff and our team, this is what they do. This is the work they're doing on the ground. And this ties into other programs as well. For those of you who work with organic growers or who are organically certified, part of organic production is managing a farm to respond to these site-specific conditions, incorporating and integrating cultural, biological, mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. This is the work that we do. This is the work we try to support and really help support all across the country. So, if you're organic certified, identifying here are the ways that I'm supporting pollinators, beneficial insects that attack crop pests, wildlife. These are all things you could document to make that case to your organic certifier that, yeah, we're doing great things to conserve biodiversity. And related to this, and taking it to the next step, a couple years ago, again, with significant support from NRCS, rolled out our Be Better certification that identifies and celebrates farmers and businesses that are adopting farm management practices that are supportive of pollinators, and really giving consumers confidence that their buying decisions are benefiting pollinators and the farmers that are working to protect them. And to do this, we've entered into we've got a third party, an independent auditor in Oregon Tilth, who comes out to the farms that are meeting this criteria to independently identify, yeah, you guys are doing this work. You're setting aside habitat, 5% of the farm, 4% of which could be cover crops that are planted year after year, but that there's habitat in the farm, that habitat is protected from pesticides, that we're thinking about nest sites for bees, that we're thinking about better management of bumblebees. All of this is bundled together in the Be Better certification. And to date, just in the last couple of years, we've got 18 certified farm companies, 28 certified farms, and over 20,000 acres of certified land. And for all of this, our staff are able to help provide and can help provide technical support and just information that you all need to help understand the criteria, meet that criteria, come up with plans. We can help you do that, help you think about that, and ideally turn this into a tool. My goal is certainly that this becomes a tool where not only are farmers recognized, but they're getting a premium on whatever crop is produced. That's certainly where I want to see this program go in the long run, so it pays. So to do all this, I've hinted this already, Xerces has put together a ton of resources. Oh, I should say, if you want support from NRCS, you can find your local service center, talk to folks there. They can help you think about a lot of this beneficial insect management work. And if they don't have the answers, they can come to us and we can provide help. But as I mentioned, if you go to our website, xerces.org, we've got a ton of materials we've built over the years to really help in the implementation of good invertebrate conservation on working landscapes. We've got books that are meant to really kind of help, be nice, easy reads to give you the big picture on what to do. And this webinar, increasingly, we're, thanks to Rachel, really have built an entire presence, a whole channel on YouTube, where if you subscribe to the Xerces Society, there are dozens of videos, webinars like this, other links to other materials, other projects and partnerships. Yeah, it's just phenomenal what's out there, where you can connect with us on a whole variety of social media platforms at Xerces Society. And to wrap up, I haven't used this in a while. For those of you who've maybe heard me talk a decade or more ago, I used to talk about Edith Patch a lot. And for some reason, I took a break from letting the world know about Dr. Patch. But as time goes on, as I get older, I've got to come back to her. She was the first woman president of the Entomological Society of America. And in 1938, she was concerned about the growing focus on, different chemicals used to control pests. And she wanted to control pests, don't get me wrong, but she was worried that this focus on pest insects was leading to a decline in other beneficial insects that were doing a lot of the work that those pesticides would do, and just the value of the majority of insects that are out there in our working landscapes. So she predicted that by 2000, which is now 21 years in our rear view window, that the president would issue a proclamation claiming that land areas at regular intervals throughout the US would be maintained as insect gardens under the direction of government entomologists, that these would be planted with milkweed and hawthorn and other plants that could sustain populations of butterflies and bees. And she predicted that sometime in the future, entomologists will be as much or more concerned with the conservation and preservation of beneficial insect life as they are now with the destruction of injurious insects. And while we certainly do not have official insect gardens maintained by government entomologists, over the last 5 years, in collaboration with NRCS and collaboration with the Farm Service Agency, there are over 1 million acres of habitat on the ground, thanks to the USDA and Farm Bill conservation programs, over 1 million acres targeting pollinators, targeting beneficial insects, targeting monarch butterflies. And it's not quite what she envisioned, but I feel like the US, the world, is increasingly taking note. The fact that you all are here is certainly part of that just the value of our ongoing collaboration with the USDA and the NRCS to get this habitat on the ground. Just for me, it's, I don't know, it's exciting and it gives me hope. So I highly recommend learning more about Edith Patch. She was quite a pioneer, quite a groundbreaker in her day, and somebody who I hold in great esteem. So with that, why don't we go tackle questions? We hit it right at the hour. If, by the way, you are a farmer, you're NRCS, you're a conservation district, you're working in working landscapes, and you want to get connected with some of our staff who are on the ground across the country, please feel free to email pollinators@xerces.org, and that's plural there, pollinators. And my team can help connect you with folks to get you some maybe more site-specific or on the ground support. And I just want to say thanks again to all of you, to Xerces Society members, which you all could become if you wanted to, no pressure, and to the NRCS just for all of your financial support and partnership over the last 20 years. And with that, Rachel, let's dive into questions?
Yeah, that sounds great. We have a few, so I'll just go ahead and read the list. And if you've already answered it, you can just go ahead and let folks know that. The first one I think you've read already, but what are the most prominent barriers to developing conservation programs? Does it vary by region?
That's a good, it's an interesting question. And I think there are a number of different ways that I could sort of interpret that. I think that, some of the barriers just involve what other priorities are out there. Like in the West, for example, there's so much effort and so much focus and money going towards irrigation efficiency and other things like that, that maybe, I don't want to say distract because they're important natural resource concerns, but issues that are kind of easier to tackle, easier to grab onto up front, maybe just have a simple technology response like, oh, I'm going to buy drip irrigation rather than have flood irrigation. And so what we found is the more that there are folks at a local level or state level asking questions, expressing interest, getting engaged, we find that, at least with, say, the NRCS, for example, that's leading to, a lot of state biologists and field offices and area offices coming to us and asking for the guidance, the help, the habitat assessment tools and things like that. So I think, just as there is more interest, those barriers get knocked down. And so many of the barriers of the past, like fair or reasonable payment scenarios to cover the costs of habitat restoration, just having the programs, these different farm bill conservation programs set up to target pollinators, to target monarch butterflies, to target beneficial insects. Many of those old barriers from 20 years ago, are gone. Like we've got a lot of programs in place, a lot of practices and enhancements clearly defined that, the table is set so much more so than it was, 10 or 15, 20 years ago. It's actually pretty exciting. Let's see, Jamie, I'm looking at your question. Not sure, I think that would have been in context with where I was, an enhancement. Oh, this goes back to the dung beetle question. I think we addressed that. Let's see. Amy, for landscape architects, can these same aspects be applied to commercial and residential developments such as hedgerow planting? Oh my gosh, absolutely. Hopefully you saw that range, in seeing those range of different habitat types planted or that we worked on across a whole variety of different farm landscapes and ranch landscapes. I've implemented those in my own 50 by 100 foot lot here in Portland, Oregon. At our old house that actually had sun, I built a whole hedgerow along the sidewalk, a diverse shrub hedgerow that had different shrubs come into bloom at different times through the growing season. I don't know, it was cool. It was beautiful. It was full of insects. All of these things, these practices can be applied into a more formal landscape. And the only thing I would suggest that's a little different is that there's, more of a formal edge on it, and that there's a little more effort applied towards design and installation and color choice and plant choice and things like that. But all of these practices can be applied in the landscape. So yeah, great question. Totally, yes. Debbie asked, how does one become part of a team doing this important work? Oh, Debbie, that's a great question. I'll give you, there are a couple pieces of advice. Early on, so many people would get an entomology degree or they knew a lot about insects, and that's great and that's important. But fundamentally, particularly in working landscapes, we need people who've got specific skills in habitat creation and restoration and management, in pest management, in range management. So having, or if you look at Xerces more broadly, skills in status evaluation and monitoring, and having those types of skill sets that help us really implement these practices, that becomes more and more important. So how do you manage a farm? How do you manage a ranch? How do you restore habitat? How do you protect that habitat from pesticides? Getting those skills. And over the years, I mean, knock on wood, for 20 years, we've grown. Hopefully that'll continue over the time ahead. So that's great, great question. Jordan writes, are there other programs nationally comparable to the New England Pollinator Partnership? Yeah, there are, in fact. So there are a few programs of sort of broad fund pools that NRCS has created. One of the most closely aligned is the monarch habitat. I forget what it's called officially, but there's a monarch habitat effort in the central states at the heart of the eastern monarch migration. So a 10-state core region that's very similar to NEPP, where there's a whole conference report that the effort's based on, so that farmers and ranchers have some predictability in terms of should the monarch butterfly eventually become listed as an endangered or threatened species. Just giving confidence that if they create habitat, that they won't have additional regulations applied. Yeah, that's in place. There's a honeybee and pollinator fund pool, similar to sort of setting aside funds as in the New England Pollinator Partnership in the Northern Plains state, that's been in place since 2013, that I helped stand up with a number of state office folks across the Northern Great Plains and the Upper Midwest. And that still to this day targets $2 to $3 million a year towards honeybee habitat and other pollinator habitat across those states. So there are some efforts like that where you've got, sort of a coordinated effort, maybe state or national fund pools available. There are other examples of state fund pools. California targets monarchs and pollinators under their declining species fund pool. Idaho for a while was setting aside $100,000 a year for pollinators and monarch conservation. Washington just this year set pollinators and monarchs as a priority for wildlife under the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program in Washington state. So a number of states are also just prioritizing funding towards pollinators or other beneficial insects. Good question. Andy writes, in the Midwest, we have sadly moved away from hedgerows. Yeah, I know, right? How can we encourage their revitalization or preservation? What's optimal when it comes to hedgerow design? I'll dig into this quite a bit more coming up in March, and particularly on the design side of things. But the short of it, I mean, frankly, as we have increased drought, as we've got more of these weather extremes, I think that there is a good chance that, I don't want to say we're going to enter a new Dust Bowl, but certainly the Dust Bowl of the 1930s got us started on windbreaks and hedgerows across these different landscapes, the agricultural landscapes throughout the heart of the United States, the heartland of the US. And then, I hope it doesn't happen, but there's certainly the chance with climate change that we'll see more of those weather extremes that could drive that again. And I would hope that, one of the challenges, of course, is with bigger machinery, it's become more efficient to have bigger fields, which means getting rid of a lot of those old windbreaks and hedgerows. And hopefully the benefit in terms of soil conservation and wildlife corridors and habitat and beneficial insects will come back. And when we're designing these hedgerows, if we're thinking about pollinators, if we're thinking about beneficial insects and wildlife, we're focused on native species and having a variety of woody plants in those hedgerows that are blooming at different times through the year, maybe even an understory of really nicely aggressive wildflowers that'll come in and help, again, hold soil and provide additional benefits. Those are some of the things that we think about. And as revitalizing windbreaks and revitalizing hedgerows, thinking about bringing those native plants and that native diversity in when we go through that restoration or revitalization process. So that's pretty good. Matt asks, would you post a citation to the Northern California declining butterfly population? Yeah, Rachel, can you make a note of that? And we can maybe stick that in as a link in the YouTube link. That'd be a good way for us to tie that in, as well as help us get at Chris Taliga's question about that updated study on value of insect pollinated crops. We can put a couple of links in there. I think we can do that, can't we? Oh, look, somebody put a link in the chat box.
Yeah, we can do that. I did put the link for the economic value of pollinators article. And then, yeah, we can put that in the YouTube description of the video.
Excellent. Okay, sweet. That would be great. So let's make sure we do that. How can I find out more? Get a link to that. Oh, the New Hampshire Insectary Strip Talk. Great question, Jennifer. For that, just go to conservationwebinars.net and do a search for Xerces or Alina or Insectaries. And that should pop up. If it may take, usually takes a couple weeks for the recordings to get uploaded, but that'll be there waiting for you in the days ahead if it not already. Stan writes, are there any studies assessing, oops, where to go, efficacy of planting native wildflowers in spaces between solar panel arrays? Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, I don't know of any, at this point, specific studies on efficacy of planting native wildflowers for pollinators, but we just know that when you plant, we know from a variety of studies that planting wildflowers just leads to higher pollinator populations. It would not be any different, I don't believe, for solar panels. And so there is a whole growing movement as people are putting out solar farms that instead of just having them on gravel or instead of just having them on, sod grass, getting more diversity there. And I think if we've got a solar farm, I'd much rather see some of that diverse habitat underneath the solar panels than just gravel and a chain link fence. I'd much rather see some sort of low growing wildflowers. Heck, even if it's just clover is better than just grass. Put a nice hedgerow around the outside of the whole array, kind of makes it all look nicer and has that additional benefit. So yeah, this is a growing movement and more people are looking to do that. Athena writes, NRCS needs producer and partner data on cost of establishment and maintenance, especially for EQIP incentive programs. A lot of this habitat pays for itself in time, but it's still a lot of work to get established. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something we've worked on a lot. We've done a really good job of documenting these costs for California. And a lot of that's gone into the payment scenarios that have been developed for a lot of these practices. But I kind of have to constantly stay on top of those payment scenarios, make sure they stay up. But if you want some examples from California, go ahead and email pollinators@xerces.org, and I'll get you connected up with Jessa, who can get you some of the estimates she's done for wildflower establishment and hedgerow establishment costs in California, at least. Good question. Emily writes, I'm a graduate student at University of Virginia studying habitat creation, rock on ag land. Excellent. Oh, good. And a co-chair of Bee Campus applying for certification. Yes. Any insights on ways to avoid contamination of habitat by pesticides due to drift or water transport? That is a long answer. We'll talk more about that in some of our upcoming webinars. And there are some actually really, I think if you go to our YouTube channel, there are a lot of webinars now about how do we reduce pesticide risk and contamination. And, one could build windbreaks designed to capture drifts, just having buffers. So much of the specifics of that answer really get at get at the specific chemistry of different pesticides. Some of them move more easily in soil, some of them don't. And so that's where, if you get in touch with us, I could get you connected with Emily May, and you can either look at our YouTube channel, or I can see if Emily can get you some advice and some feedback and maybe help answer your question a little more specifically for where you're at. James writes, can we start a New York City team? Narrows Botanical become them. All right, that sounds great, James. Eugene writes, mini urban forests, are gaining traction. Are you seeing this concept of planting getting attention in the US? I have not even heard of the Miyawaki forest idea, but that idea of a small urban forest, which would by its very nature have potentially more light in the understory, I could just see that having a huge amount of benefits. And if one, as part of the design of that, thought about, two different things. From a pollinator perspective, thought about basswood and cherry and maple and having these different tree species that we know provide a lot of benefit. You could have pollinator forage in that tree canopy, but also just thinking about abundance of insects. This is where oaks don't necessarily provide they don't provide nectar, although a lot of aphids on oaks lead to some interesting oak honey. But oaks support a greater abundance and diversity of insects as overall, compared to almost any other tree in the temperate zone, in temperate, North America. Ash is the same. Oaks and ash support a huge variety of different moths and butterflies and other insects. And so thinking broadly about insect biodiversity, many forests focus on native tree species. I think that's key too, can have some of the greatest benefits. Could be doing things like grabbing carbon, cooling cities, but also adding a tremendous amount of wildlife habitat for a variety of invertebrates, but also birds and other things too. So I think small forests in urban settings sounds like a great idea. Cody works on endangered snail. What information is available on snail management? Oh my goodness, and not killing, but preserving biodiversity of snails. That is outside of my expertise. We have folks who do a ton of work on aquatic conservation. Most of that has been on freshwater mussels. So you could get in touch, and I could see if folks in our kind of mussel freshwater conservation team maybe have some links they could recommend, but I don't, sadly. Let's see, coming back to the ivermectin question, a lot of the labels claim not to impact dung beetles because they don't kill adults, but are harmful to juveniles. Oh, right, they're probably growth regulator. Oh, actually, I should know, but I don't know as much about ivermectins as I should. The CSP enhancement for dung beetles allows NRCS to make a decision on which chemicals can be used for pest control that are not harmful. We could use non-biased info to help determine what chemicals are actually safe. Athena, that'd be a great one, and we could help out with that and kind of put some time into that. We could get the folks in our Northern Plains teams in Nebraska, North Dakota, to put some time into looking into that. So if you wouldn't mind, shoot me an email and let's see what we can do. It'd be great to know where you're based too, just to have a good sense of that. Let's see, Andy chiming in, herbicide resistant crops are now the norm. Are these herbicides like Roundup killing soil-based invertebrates, and what's the best practice around crops and maintaining biodiversity? I tend to be much less concerned about herbicide use or direct herbicide impacts on soil invertebrates compared to insecticide use, and sort of the kind of picking my battles kind of around, and just not having infinite time. I do think that with herbicide resistant crops, ideally we encourage, farmers to follow sort of, using the least amount of herbicide as possible. I think there's a tendency with something like glyphosate to feel like it's so benign, quote unquote, that, oh, it doesn't matter, we just get out there and spray, whenever, like more than we maybe need to, and trying to be as targeted and use as little as possible, certainly I think is for the best. And also part of just good integrated pest management, good for reducing the development of resistant crops, of herbicide resistant weeds, thus eliminating that tool in the future. I think we just need to be using the least amount possible. And I worry there's not enough of an emphasis on that. But although I'd like to hope that's changing. But the best practice is to use as little as possible to get the job done in as targeted a way as possible, and to avoid applying those herbicides on any habitat, trying to protect that habitat around those farm fields, and ideally replacing, weedy areas with some sort of plant community that helps keep the weeds out, but also supports beneficial insects. All right, Athena, we talked about ivermectins, managing forests and forest edges for deadwood. Oh, that's an interesting. Certainly, we have a growing amount of resources on managing forests, particularly forest edges, and particularly in the Northeast. This is something our staff and the NRCS up there are interested a lot, both for the pollinator benefits as well as for other sort of early successional habitat. And ideally, as part of that, one is incorporating deadwood into that because of the benefits for birds, because frankly, there's a whole invertebrate insect community, including a lot of bees and wasps and other beneficial insects that'll move into old snags and deadwood. And we've got materials that we came out with just in the last year on nest sites for bees that involve or include deadwood. or brush piles and things like that. So I could, if you either go to our website, you can look for the new guidelines and nest materials, or just shoot an email to pollinators@xerces.org. And I can connect you with that, as well as to some of the things that have been put together on edge feathering, for example, and pushing back wood edges and whatnot. And oh, Athena's looking at maintenance costs. Yeah, okay, I need to think about that. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to think more about that. Elizabeth writes, yes, she's correct. There's a bill moving through Washington state legislature focused on pollinator health. Definitely check that out. Xerces was a partner with a whole variety of other partners on the ground in the state, working on as part of a task force on a whole set of recommendations, and several of those recommendations are in there. Yeah, several of those recommendations are in there, and I think, yeah, it's a good piece of legislation. I have to admit, I have not read it, although I've got a tracker on it. I have not read it closely yet. All right, we're on the home stretch. For those of you who are sticking around, awesome. I'm just going to keep answering questions until they're done. Lori asks, any suggestions for stink bug control? You know, depending on where you are, like buckwheat, any of these plantings that have small flowers that are really good at providing nectar and some pollen for those tiny little parasitic wasps, that becomes, you know, supporting parasitic wasps, supporting parasitic flies that can be attacking adult stink bugs as well as their eggs, is really valuable. And that's included buckwheat, that's included alyssum in some farm landscapes. There's just a whole variety of small flowered plants out there that are feeding parasitic flies and wasps that are value as well. Other stink bugs though, there are sand wasps that if you've got any piles of sand or sandy areas in and around a farm, there are sand wasps out there that collect, you know, dozens of stink bugs to bring paralyze and bring back to their nest to then lay eggs on. And so having sandy areas in the landscape is a way that, you know, we've certainly seen a lot of sand wasps feeding on stink bugs. There are other, frankly, there are predatory stink bugs as well as herbivore stink bugs, and the predaceous stink bugs, if you've got good habitat out there, they'll sometimes show up. So be careful when you're looking at your stink bugs. Don't go killing them all, because some of them are actually killing the bad ones. So yeah, buckwheat's been good for that in Georgia and the Southeast. And I think knowing where you're from, where you live, that would help in terms of plant choice. But yeah, lots out there. Sarah writes, any studies or resources on the impact of GMO crops on insect populations? You know, there was a big scare when I was a grad student around BT corn, for example, and worried that the pollen from BT corn was affecting monarchs. And again, the insecticide use in the landscape is a bigger immediate driver. And I have not recently heard of any strong evidence that some of our GMO crops are, you know, impacting certainly pollinators. I should know, but I do not know how, you know, say some of these GMO crops are maybe affecting underground insects, beneficial insects. Now, BT, which is one of the most common, you know, proteins that are incorporated into GMO crops for attacking Lepidoptera, so like Lepidoptera pests, that, you know, that BT is pretty specific to just butterflies and moths. And so if in the roots, you know, wouldn't be necessarily affecting, say, a lot of our beneficial insects, which are beetles, you know, that are living in the ground there. And so I predict less of an impact, but I don't know a lot about, you know, other concerns. Hasn't risen in the conservation community. Working on working lands is not much of a concern. That being said, what I was talking about before about, say, herbicide resistant crops, there is a huge potential there for loss of habitat or unnecessary, you know, over application of herbicides, and strongly encourage people to really minimize that. And frankly, I've got a lot of concerns, not so much about glyphosate resistant crops or Roundup ready crops, but more about the dicamba and the 2,4-D resistant crops that are leading to conflicts between farmers. You know, soybeans that are say 2,4-D resistance planted next to those that aren't, and then the burning that's gone on and the loss of those crops has led to a lot of conflicts, but also the loss of habitat. You know, a lot of those broadleaf herbicides kill a lot of good pollinator habitat. So that's a real concern. Yeah, Kim, you are totally right. Overuse leads to resistance, leads to losing tools that could be targeted, and I think it's a real problem. Oh, Kim asked, would I elaborate a little bit more on the cover crop in orchard and why I made that little side comment about clover. In our work, say with cherry orchards in Oregon, for example, or even tree fruit in Oregon, if you've got clover, one of the pests within those orchards are voles girdling trees, and those voles also like to forage on a lot of those clover and legume. And so if you've got small rodent problems, adding that much clover underneath an orchard just has the potential to increase other pest problems. And so that's where it's important to understand, kind of what's driving other pest issues. And if you're creating good habitat to try to, minimize unintended consequences. And so that's a situation where, we probably focus more, if we're doing cover cropping in and around orchards in Oregon, focus more on mustards, for example, as opposed to those clovers. Or if voles aren't a problem, or if there are strategies like leaving unvegetated strips immediately below the trees and maybe having clover or legumes in the outside or someplace where you're not bringing them close in, there are things we can think about there. Whew. All right, let's see, Sam. For those interested in hedgerows, yeah, the UK and other parts of Europe have a mostly intact tradition of, lost it. Let's see, where'd that go? Let's see what Sam was saying. Of hedge laying, yeah, that produces really fantastic habitat. I have to say, the US is far behind the UK when it comes to really, I think, cool and interesting strategies for managing hedgerows. There are so many practices like hedge laying and coppicing and all these different things that almost create living fences. I mean, these would have been how one kept your cattle confined. You don't necessarily need a fence. You create a hedgerow and hedge lay it and create this thicket that was tremendous bird habitat and insect habitat, and also a really nice, barrier to keep the cows in. So I'd like to think that as time goes on, we'll see more creativity there in how hedgerows are managed and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, it's fun. That's a fun thing to play with, frankly, for quality habitat and, living fencing for that matter. Yeah, anyway, thanks for that, Sam. Thanks, Andy, appreciate that. Thanks, Kim. Let's see, James adding in suggestions for plantings on public highways, green spaces. Yes, yes, and yes. If you go to our website, there are two places I would recommend. Our website's got a really nice section now on roadsides, right-of-ways. Jennifer Hopwood, who works with me, is a international leader in roadside habitat and right-of-way habitat for pollinators. And we've worked with the Federal Highways Administration and other collaborators for years, pulling together really useful, I think, information on what to plant, how to manage highway green space, public highway green space. The Federal Highways Administration has some like a whole room on pollinators. If you just do a search on the Google for Federal Highway Administration and pollinators, you will be brought to a room that has links to the eco-regional revegetation application to help in plant choice. That will bring you to a whole slew, just a ton of material on guidelines and guidebooks we've written that Jennifer's really taken the lead on writing about highway and roadsides management. Like, how do you reduce mowing frequency and save some money, although potentially lose some jobs, but let's say save some money and yeah, I don't know, just having better habitat, if not bringing back whole corridors of native plants. So yes, Jennifer Hopwood is my staff, who's really at the leading edge on a lot of that right-of-ways and roadsides habitat management and value based, and she's based in Omaha, Nebraska.